The day they cut down my trees, they thought they were improving a view. 3 months later, they were staring at a locked steel gate, wondering how a $40 million development had been stopped by one stubborn guy with a property deed. And the crazy part is, if they had just asked me first, none of it would have happened. A few years ago, after nearly 20 years of working commercial electrical contracts across 3 states, I reached a point where I couldn't stand noise anymore. Not because I was getting old, although my knees would probably argue otherwise, but because I'd spent so much of my life surrounded by deadlines, traffic, job sites, ringing phones, and people wanting something from me every 5 minutes. I wanted one place that belonged entirely to me. That's how I ended up buying a property outside a small mountain community called Alder Ridge. It wasn't some luxury ranch. The house was modest, the driveway needed work, and the nearest grocery store was 20 minutes away. Most people would have seen inconveniences. I saw freedom. The real value wasn't the house anyway. It was the land. Nearly 10 acres wrapped in massive cedar and pine trees that had probably been standing there since before my grandfather was born. Those trees created a natural wall around the property. From my porch, I couldn't see another house. More importantly, nobody could see me. Every morning, I'd sit outside with coffee and watch the sunlight move through the branches while deer wandered across the edge of the clearing. It felt like the world had finally gone quiet. The locals understood why people moved there. Nobody bothered each other. If you waved, people waved back. If you needed help, they showed up. If you wanted privacy, they respected it. My closest neighbor was an older retired school principal named Walter Grayson. Walter lived about half a mile down the road with his golden retriever and an endless collection of stories. Every couple of weeks, we'd sit on his porch drinking iced tea while he complained about politicians, and I pretended to disagree just to keep the conversation interesting. Life moved slowly in Alder Ridge, and honestly, that was the whole appeal. Then one spring morning, everything started changing. Survey flags appeared behind my property. A week later came trucks, then bulldozers, then excavators. Within a month, the entire hillside behind me looked like someone had ripped open the earth with a giant shovel. I asked Walter if he knew what was happening. He just shook his head and said, "Some city developer bought all that land. Heard he's planning luxury homes." I laughed and said, "Up there? Good luck." Walter didn't laugh. People with enough money can build almost anywhere. Looking back, that might have been the smartest thing anyone said during the entire situation. Construction accelerated fast. Trees disappeared. Roads appeared. Utility lines were marked. Heavy equipment crawled across the hillside from sunrise to sunset. I didn't love it, but it wasn't my land. Property rights work both ways. If they stayed on their side of the line, I had no reason to complain. Then one afternoon, I drove past a giant sign near the entrance of the project. Summit Crest Estates. Luxury mountain living. Floor-to-ceiling glass. Uninterrupted valley views. That last phrase stuck in my head for some reason. Uninterrupted valley views. Maybe because I knew exactly what stood between those future homes and those views. My trees. A few weeks later, I met the man running the project. His name was Everett Sloan. He looked exactly like the kind of developer who puts his own face on billboards. Expensive watch. Perfect smile. Crisp button-down, shirt despite, standing in the middle of a muddy construction site. I was repairing part of my fence when he walked over and introduced himself. At first, the conversation seemed friendly enough. Then his eyes drifted toward the tree line behind my house. "Beautiful property," he said. "Those trees must block quite a bit of the valley." I remember smiling. That's what I like about them. He laughed politely. I didn't. For a second, something awkward settled between us. Then he changed the subject and walked away. The conversation lasted maybe 3 minutes, but something about it bothered me. It felt less like a compliment and more like an evaluation, like a man standing in front of a problem he hadn't solved yet. The following months brought more construction, more workers, more noise, but eventually I stopped paying attention. The project became part of the background. Then, one morning around 6:30, I woke up to chainsaws. At first, I assumed they were working somewhere on the development. But as I lay there listening, something felt wrong. The sound was too close. Way too close. I got out of bed, pulled on my boots, walked onto the back porch, and immediately froze. For a second, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. The sunlight looked different, brighter, wider. Then it hit me. 3 of the largest pines on my property were gone. Completely gone. Fresh stumps sat in the dirt. Sawdust covered the ground. Branches were stacked nearby, waiting to be hauled away. And through the opening where those trees had stood for decades, I could suddenly see straight into the luxury development behind me. I didn't feel angry right away. Honestly, I felt confused. My mind kept searching for a reasonable explanation because surely nobody would be stupid enough to cut trees on someone else's property. Then I saw workers farther up the slope, and in that moment, confusion disappeared. I started walking toward them, and with every step across my backyard, something inside me got quieter, colder, more focused. By the time I reached the crew, I already knew one thing. Somebody had just made a very expensive mistake. Somebody had just made a very expensive mistake. I walked straight up the slope toward the crew, and the closer I got, the more obvious it became that nobody there expected to be questioned. A few workers were feeding branches into a chipper, while another guy stood near a loader, checking something on a tablet. I stopped about 10 feet away and said, "Who authorized this?" The man looked up. "Authorized what?" I pointed behind me. "Those trees. On my property." The expression on his face changed immediately. Not guilt exactly, more like discomfort. The kind of look people get when they realize they're standing in the middle of a problem they didn't create. "You'll need to talk to management," he said. "I already am talking to management." He shook his head and pointed uphill. "Project manager's up there." So I kept walking. At the top of the ridge stood Everett Sloan, hands in his pockets, sunglasses on, looking out across the valley like he was admiring a painting he had personally commissioned. The second he saw me approaching, he knew why I was there. I could tell from the way his shoulders shifted. "Morning," he said casually. "You cut my trees. No greeting. No small talk. Just the truth sitting between us." Everett glanced toward the opening in the tree line and shrugged. Actually shrugged. There was some confusion regarding the boundary. "No," I said. "There's no confusion. Those trees were on my property." He pulled off his sunglasses and sighed like I was creating an inconvenience for him. "Look, those homes are being marketed around premium views. We needed a clear sight line." I stared at him for a second because I genuinely couldn't believe what I was hearing. Not because he had done it, because he was admitting it so casually. "You knowingly removed trees that didn't belong to you? We'll compensate you." To this day, I remember how quickly he said it. Like money automatically solved everything. Like every problem had a price tag attached. I looked back toward the stumps. Those trees had been there long before either of us existed. Storms hadn't taken them down. Disease hadn't taken them down. One guy chasing profit had taken them down because they were inconvenient. Everett crossed his arms. "Name a number." That sentence told me everything I needed to know about him. In his world, every disagreement ended with a transaction. Every principle eventually had a dollar amount. But he was about to discover something that people like him rarely encounter. Not everybody wants money. I looked him directly in the eye and said, "You're going to regret this." Then I turned around and left. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten him. I didn't call the police from the ridge. Honestly, I wasn't even completely sure what I was going to do yet. I just knew I wasn't accepting a check and moving on. That night, I pulled every property document I owned out of a filing cabinet in my office. Survey maps, deeds, easement agreements, boundary records, old title paperwork from previous owners. Around midnight, I was still sitting at my desk when something caught my attention. A notation on an old survey. I grabbed another map, then another. Suddenly, I wasn't tired anymore. The only access road serving Summit Crest Estates crossed a narrow strip of land at the edge of my property. Not public land, not county land. Mine. I spent the next several hours verifying everything. By 2 in the morning, I had copies of old agreements spread across the desk. The previous owner had allowed temporary access years earlier through a simple, revocable agreement. The arrangement had never been converted into a permanent easement. When I purchased the property, that agreement effectively expired unless renewed. It never had been. I leaned back in my chair and just stared at the maps. Then I started laughing. Not because it was funny, because the irony was unbelievable. Everett had spent millions planning a luxury development, and apparently nobody had bothered to verify whether they permanently controlled the only road leading into it. The next morning, I called an attorney. By lunchtime, I had confirmation. By mid-afternoon, I had contractors scheduled. 48 hours later, heavy equipment rolled onto my property. Workers installed concrete barriers, a steel security gate, new fencing, updated property markers. Everything completely legal. Everything documented. Everything exactly where it was supposed to be. By sunset, the road was closed. The first signs of chaos appeared the next morning. Construction trucks lined up along the county road with nowhere to go. Delivery vehicles were turned around. Equipment operators sat inside idling machines waiting for instructions that never came. I watched part of it from my porch with a cup of coffee. Walter eventually drove over in his old pickup. He climbed out, looked toward the gate, looked at me, then started laughing so hard he had to grab the side of his truck. "You actually did it. Looks that way. People in town are already talking." Good. By noon, Everett was standing on my front porch. This time he wasn't smiling. "Open the gate." I handed him a copy of the survey. "No." He looked at the paperwork for maybe 3 seconds before shoving it back toward me. "You can't shut down an entire development." "Apparently I can." His jaw tightened. "Do you understand how much money is involved here? Do you understand how old those trees were?" For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he tried a different approach. "Let's be reasonable." I almost laughed. "You cut down my trees without permission, and now you want reasonable?" He left angry. The lawyers arrived next. Demand letters, threats, legal arguments, emergency requests. None of them worked because the facts were simple. The road crossed private property. No permanentement existed. Access depended entirely on my consent. Weeks passed, then more weeks. Construction slowed to a crawl before stopping altogether. The project looked different every time I drove by. Half-finished foundations collected rainwater. Framing crews disappeared. Materials sat covered beneath tarps. Investors began asking questions. Rumors spread throughout Alder Ridge. Some people supported me. Some thought I had gone too far. At the diner downtown, I overheard arguments between complete strangers discussing the situation. One afternoon, a woman approached me while I was pumping gas and said, "You're the road guy, aren't you?" I knew things had gotten big when people started identifying me that way. The financial pressure on Summit Crest Estates kept growing. Every delayed inspection cost money. Every missed deadline cost money. Every idle crew cost money. Eventually, news started leaking out through contractors who knew somebody in accounting. The losses were becoming serious, real serious. And for the first time since all this started, I began hearing something I hadn't heard before. Everett Sloan was worried. Really worried, because it turned out that building an alternative road wasn't realistic. The terrain around the development was steep and unstable. Environmental approvals could take years. Additional land acquisitions would cost a fortune. The road through my property wasn't simply convenient. It was essential, and the longer that gate stayed closed, the more pressure built behind it. Eventually, pressure does what pressure always does. It finds a weakest point. And by the beginning of the 4th month, that weakest point wasn't the gate anymore. It was Everett Sloan himself. And by the beginning of the 4th month, that weakest point wasn't the gate anymore. It was Everett Sloan himself. The change didn't happen overnight, but once I noticed it, I couldn't stop seeing it. The confidence that had defined him from the day we met was gone. The billboard at the entrance still promised luxury mountain living and uninterrupted valley views. But now it stood over a construction site that looked frozen in time. Exposed framing sat weathering under the sun. Stacks of materials remained untouched. Temporary fencing leaned in the wind. What was supposed to become the crown jewel of the region had started looking more like an expensive warning sign. Around town, the conversations changed too. In the beginning, people talked about the trees. Then they talked about the gate. Now, they talked about money. Investors pulling back. Contractors demanding payment schedules. Buyers asking for refunds on deposits. Even Walter, who usually enjoyed every minute of local drama, eventually stopped joking about it. One afternoon, we were sitting on his porch when he looked out toward the ridge and said, Funny thing about arrogance. What's that? I asked. Most people think it makes you stronger. Usually it just makes you blind. I remember thinking about that for a long time afterward because it perfectly described everything that had happened. Everett never believed he could lose because nobody had ever forced him to consider that possibility. People had probably been saying yes to him for years. Then one morning, a black SUV pulled into my driveway. I knew it was before the engine shut off. Everett stepped out alone. No attorney. No project managers. No consultants. No expensive smile. Just him. For a few seconds, he stood beside the vehicle, looking toward the property, almost like he was seeing it for the first time. Then he slowly walked over. I was sitting on the porch with coffee, same chair, same view, same place where I'd spent hundreds of quiet mornings before any of this started. Mind if I sit? He asked. I looked at the empty chair beside me. Go ahead. He sat down. For nearly a minute, neither of us spoke. The silence felt different than it would have months earlier. Back then, it would have been a contest. Now it felt more like exhaustion. Finally, Everett cleared his throat. I've replayed that day in my head 100 times. I didn't answer. He nodded slowly, maybe more than 100. Then he looked toward the gap where my trees used to stand. Some replacement work had already begun, but the wound was still visible. I should have asked. Yeah, I said. You should have. Another long silence followed. Then came the question I'd been waiting months to hear. What do you want? Not what will make this go away. Not how much money. Not what's your price. What do you want? That distinction mattered. Because for the first time, he wasn't negotiating. He was listening. I set my coffee down and looked out across the property. You know what the funny part is? I said, this was never about the trees. He looked surprised. It wasn't. No, the trees were the symptom. He frowned. Then what was it about? I pointed toward the hillside. You looked at something that belonged to somebody else and decided your goals mattered more than their rights. That's what this has always been about. He didn't argue. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. You never asked because you assumed the answer didn't matter. You figured you could cut first and solve the problem later with a check. Everett lowered his eyes. You're probably right. I know I'm right. The honesty seemed to hit him harder than any legal letter ever had. For several hours over the following weeks, attorneys, surveyors, environmental consultants, and both sides worked through a final agreement. The settlement ended up being far more comprehensive than anyone expected. Everett's company funded mature tree replacements instead of small saplings. Soil restoration specialists repaired damage caused by the clearing. Additional privacy barriers were installed. Long-term environmental protections were added to prevent future encroachment. Most importantly, a permanent access agreement was drafted with strict conditions, detailed limitations, mandatory notifications, and severe financial penalties for any future violation. Every inch of that road now came with responsibilities attached. Nothing would ever depend on assumptions again. The day the final documents were signed, I drove down to the gate and watched the barriers being removed. Construction vehicles slowly began moving through once more. Nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated. It wasn't that kind of ending. Some victories feel loud. This one felt quiet, like setting down a weight you've been carrying for too long. Over the following year, the development was completed. Families moved into the homes. Landscaping appeared. Roads were paved. Life continued. Occasionally, I'd see residents walking their dogs or driving past. Most had no idea how close the entire project had come to collapse. To them, it was just another neighborhood. To me, it was a reminder. One evening nearly a year later, I saw Everett standing near the entrance during a community event. We spotted each other from across the road. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he raised a hand. I nodded back. That was it. No speeches. No friendship. No dramatic reconciliation. Just mutual understanding. Sometimes that's the closest thing to closure real life offers. Looking back now, people still ask whether I went too far. Some think I should have taken the money immediately. Others think I should have sued for even more. A few insist both sides were stubborn. Maybe they're right. Maybe they're not. The truth is, I still don't know if there was a perfect solution. What I do know is that if I'd accepted what happened without pushing back, the lesson would have been very different. It would have taught everyone involved that property rights only matter until someone wealthier decides otherwise. And That was a lesson I wasn't willing to leave behind. The replacement trees are growing now. Every year, they get a little taller. Every year, the privacy returns a little more. Sometimes I sit on the porch in the early morning and watch sunlight filter through the branches, and I think about how easily all of it could have been lost if nobody had drawn a line. So now I want to hear from you. If someone destroyed part of your property because it benefited their business, would you have done what I did? Would you have locked the gate, stood your ground, and forced accountability? Or would you have taken the money and moved on? Let me know down in the comments, because stories like this always split people right down the middle. And honestly, even all these years later, folks around Alder Ridge still can't agree whether I defended my rights or whether I turned a simple dispute into the most expensive lesson a developer ever learned.